IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. We have an interesting episode lined up for you today, and it's going to be a little different from what we usually do on Fridays. We talk a lot about history, generally, perceptions of history, and what we can learn about the complexities of modern India from what's gone down in our past. But today we're going to be talking once again about history, but from a rather different angle. And that is specifically historical fiction. What does fiction that's set in historical settings across the Indian subcontinent tell us about the way that modern audiences engage with our past? What does it tell us about the complexities of history as written by modern authors? And what kind of implications does it hold for perceptions of history in the years that lie ahead of us? We're going to be talking about a whole bunch of really interesting books. So stick with us till the end. You're sure to get some fascinating book recommendations. I'm definitely looking forward to it. Let me welcome once again my friend Rajat Ubhaykar. Welcome, Rajat. So nice to have you back on All Things Policy again.
Thanks for having me, Anirudh, and I'm really looking forward to our discussion today.
Okay, fantastic. So, for those who haven't heard Rajat's previous episode on All Things Policy, Rajat is a journalist and the author of Truck Day India, A Hitchhiker's Guide to Hindustan. It's an absolutely fascinating travelogue that was written as Rajat traveled across the country hitchhiking with truckers. And it's a really interesting and unique perspective on Indian travel that I haven't really come across in my reading quite generally. So, there's going to be a link in the description of this podcast, of course. So consider that to be our first book recommendation of the day. But without any further ado, Rajat, can you tell us a little bit about the historical fiction that you've been reading, and what kind of perspectives have you unearthed from reading historical fiction that you think are generally kind of ignored in our mainstream discussions about Indian history?
Yeah. So, see, I'm not as a caveat, I'm not a historical fiction expert or a writer. I'm just an enthusiast. I've read a lot of it, and I'm a history buff just like you. So, with that caveat, so I've been reading some interesting historical fiction in the last year or so, and I feel that historical fiction allows us to unearth perspectives about Indian history that are not really present in, say, the history textbooks. It allows us to see history from the perspective of individuals. I mean, the individual is often buried under the weight of wars and dates and so on. But in historical fiction, the individual often gets to claim agency, and you see, like, there's always this question in history, right? Whether individuals do play a role in history, or whether it's the circumstances around them that force them and compel them in certain ways. So the great man theory of history. And historical fiction allows us, I think, to really explore this particular tension in the perspectives on history in these two schools. And it often comes out on the side of the individual. One book that I read recently was a book called Panipat by this Marathi writer called Vishwas Patel. I read in translation, and it really opened my eyes to how wars were waged in medieval India. I mean, right from the logistics of mobilizing entire armies at short notice, how to provide fodder for the beasts that accompany them, and complicated by the fact that the Marathas had an entire villages, the women, children accompanying them, so that they could visit pilgrimages in North India. So they thought they'd just tag along with the army, which really complicated matters from a logistical perspective. So this book really opened my eyes in no other way a history textbook has about how wars were waged. I mean, you just read that this guy won the war and this guy lost it, but how it was actually waged is the stuff of, I think, academic texts which ordinary people don't get to read. And historical fiction, in this way, it manages to really enlighten the reader about the business of waging war in medieval India.
So it's really interesting that you bring up the fact that wars are fundamentally massive logistical exercises, right? Because I feel like we have this conception of war, shaped, of course, by the media that we generally consume, that's totally untrue to the kind of reality of the business of waging war. There's a reason why it was such an important and world shaping dynamic through most of human history, and that is because it ends up mobilizing massive numbers of people. And to be able to successfully wage war means you have to successfully build up systems that allow you to move those many people around vast stretches of territory. And that's not something that just any state can do. It's something that's very complex, and it's something that requires a very significant amount of understanding of everything from basic administration to logistics to even all the way down to human psychology. So it's very interesting that you talk about, for example, families accompanying the army because they wanted to go on pilgrimages. Like, that's such a fascinating detail, and I had no idea that that kind of thing could have happened. But now that you mention it, does actually make a lot of sense, because Indian armies just generally were composed not just of manly men in shiny black and gold armor tying themselves to palm trees and catapulting themselves over walls. These are families that are moving together. Common soldiers very often moved with their families. We know that, for example, when kings moved around, that the entire palace was basically on the move with them. We have so many examples from medieval India where the administrative apparatus is accompanying the king, making land grants at various sacred sites. So it's very interesting to see that this actually continued right up to the early modern period. And again, to me, what is most fascinating is the fact that individuals really shine through, right? An army is not just a collection of guys who just want to go and kill some other guys. It's a collection of human beings who are motivated by all these ideological systems, who have their own reasons and motivations for going to war, who want to achieve different things, different outcomes from the fact of fighting and killing their enemies. So it's very interesting that that's something that comes across through this book. Now, if I'm a little quiet through any part of this podcast, I just want to tell our listeners that it's because I am sitting and typing out all these recommendations into my Google search bar. And I can absolutely guarantee that if you're interested in any aspect of history, you are better off reading the books that Rajat is going to recommend than watching whatever Bollywood interprets these events as being. But coming back to our discussion, Rajat, tell us more. What other books have you been reading? What other interesting historical dynamics from the bottom up have come up through your explorations of historical fiction?
Yeah. So, one really interesting book that I read recently was another work of regional literature, this time in Bengali. And it's this book called Aranyak by Bibhuti Bhushan Bandyopadhyay. So, this book is not essentially a work of historical fiction, but it's about his own semi autobiographical experiences living in a forest as the agent of a local zamindar who has under his rule like vast lands composed of forests, of some fields in between, and it's about his experience as an administrator in these lands. Okay, and it's set in the early 1900s as the British Raj was slowly beginning to percolate into the interior parts of say Jharkhand, Odisha, where this book is set. And so one really interesting aspect of history that I experienced from here was so this is the only book in which the character encounters a megalithic chieftain. So yeah, so these guys, the Gonds in Central Eastern India, they have a living megalithic tradition. And this writer, on his various excursions through the forest, he becomes friends with the locals there, and he finally meets up with this Raja, who is the descendant of megalithic chieftains. And then he takes him to this hilltop, which is their sacred place, where there are all these dolmens and all these megalithic monuments. And that really blew my mind because I had never ever encountered any sort of this aspect of Indian history in literature, and this can only really be experienced through fiction. I feel so. It was just mind blowing, and he describes it in very poetic terms. How the so-called Aryan migration into India, how it has because it was written in the 1930s and so on. So it's the history is not very up to date, but he talks about the enslavement of the local tribes, how they were brought under the control, how they had their own traditions in the past, which were then devalued in many ways. So this was another fascinating read.
What I find so interesting about this, Rajat, is just how prevalent, pervasive, and enduring really the megalithic culture of like various parts of India is. There's a general stereotype when you think about history that we kind of progress seamlessly from a Stone Age into a Bronze Age, then into an Iron Age, and from there, that's where history really begins. But the reality of it is so much more complex. Like, in a lot of cases, even if you look at ancient and medieval India, you see there's a continuity between megalithic cultures and cultures that are very well aware of bronze and iron, but still continue to retain aspects of megalithic tradition. So there's two examples that spring to mind immediately. The first is Buddhism in Andhra Pradesh. Now, Buddhism in Andhra Pradesh actually fell on very fertile ground because it seems that there was already a tradition of interring ancestors in dolmens and so on. And we have some interesting archaeological evidence from Amaravati, where one of the greatest of all Andhra stupas was built, which show that these small stupas to the remains of monks, or of Telugu or Andhra monks, were actually built on the remains of pre-existing megalithic sites. Now, this could have been a process of Buddhists coming in and kind of claiming pre-existing holy sites, or it could have been a process of a seamless transition of ancestor worship to the worship of ancestors who also happen to be Buddhist. And even more recently, right? So, I mean, recently, of course, being a relative term, we have examples from the Malaprabha River Valley, which was the seat of the old Chalukya kingdom from roughly the 7th, 8th centuries onwards. We know of examples where temples were built near existing dolmen sites, and the dolmens were actually being worshipped alongside these very architecturally sophisticated temples. So we give so much credit to the quote unquote great tradition, which incorporates the Mahabharata and the Vedas and the Upanishads and the Ramayana. And of course, these are a very ancient and long lasting tradition, but alongside these, you also have so many other equally ancient, if not more ancient, traditions in the Indian subcontinent, which still are being practiced to this very day and just do not get a lot of attention. So it's very fascinating that this actually mentioned historical fiction. It's very cool.
Yeah, I mean, really, this kind of scope, I think only historical fiction possesses in many ways to bring out these characters who have fallen by the wayside, right? In the who have completely fallen by the wayside. So it was really eye opening for me.
So on the subject of characters who have kind of fallen by the wayside, now this of course, these people are of course not as neglected necessarily as Adivasi peoples are, but medieval Indian queens. This is something that I've recently been getting very interested in due to the work of this scholar called Devika Rangachari, and what she does is she looks at primary sources from the early medieval period, mostly land grants and that kind of thing. In some cases, some royal epics such as the Rajatarangini of Kalhana from medieval Kashmir, and she kind of tries to interpret them to kind of re-visibilize medieval royal women. Now, when we think about Indian queens, most people used to think, for example, of let's say Noor Jahan or Mumtaz Mahal or any number of like Mughal queens. More recently, people think about quote unquote Manikarnika as popularized by a certain controversial Bollywood actress. But even before that, like there's a tendency to think about medieval Indian queens as basically these, these very sanskari individuals who just like, sat by their husband's side when they were performing great and pious sacrifices. But the picture that Devika Rangachari kind of paints, primarily through her academic research, but also through her historical fiction, is of medieval queens who are absolutely ruthless, who are just as power hungry as their male relatives, just as capable of ruling, just as willing to engage in violence, and who have been systematically erased from our understanding of Indian history by nationalist historians in the 20th century. I read her book Queen of Ice. So it's children's fiction, so it's not as long as detailed as I would have liked it to be, but even the hints that she was able to give of this fascinating queen called Didda, who is this medieval Kashmiri individual who very interestingly was one of the few disabled or differently abled people that we know of from medieval Indian history. She supposedly had a club foot, or she was lame, so she could not walk properly. So there's this one throwaway inscription that she found which mentions an individual called Valga, who was some lady who apparently used to carry Didda around for sports and various things like that. And so basically she makes Valga one of the viewpoint characters in her novel and tries to tell from Valga's and from Didda's point of view how Didda kind of rises through the ranks and becomes one of the most important of medieval Kashmiri rulers. So once again, it kind of ties into the points that you made earlier, that it actually enables you to see history from the ground up, to see the individuals and how they're shaped by their circumstances. Because, and she gives it a very interesting spin, because Dida's made fun of for being disabled. Her father has a lot of contempt for her, because she is not, the perfect daughter. She is not perfect in body, and therefore she cannot be married off to, make a very valuable marital alliance. And as a result of that childhood trauma, she actually becomes all the more determined to seize and hold power in her own right. So, and at the same time, she also tells it from the perspective of her aide Valga, who is terrified by how ruthless this queen becomes through her career. And once again, that's such a unique take in the way that we generally think about medieval Indian queens
Yeah.
today.
Yeah, on the subject of medieval Indian queens, right? Like another book I would recommend listeners check out is The 20th Wife by Indu Sundaresan. So she's written extensively about Mughal India and especially Noor Jahan. And she was one of the first historical fiction writers to come out of India in the 90s or something. And she's written around 5, 6 books on this theme, and very well done, very well researched. I've read one of them. I really enjoyed it. And it really brings out medieval Indian women, and especially the queens from the obscurity of history. So I really enjoyed that as well.
So one queen that, I mean, I don't know if one can really call her a queen, maybe more like a princess, that I find very interesting is Mirabai, from early modern, late medieval Rajasthan. And so there's this really interesting book by Kiran Nagarkar called Cuckold, which kind of tries to tell Mira's story from the perspective of her husband, who is absolutely obsessed, and he becomes extremely jealous with her love for Krishna, because he's head over heels in love with her because of how beautiful she is. But the fact that she refuses to find him interesting and is much more interested in the god drives him basically mad with jealousy. And he sees it as a affront to his manhood, of course, and like that drives him down some very dark and very interesting psychological paths. And it's also like, I mean, I'm not an expert in late medieval Rajasthan. I don't know too much about Rajput culture, though I know the broad contours. But it is very interesting how he weaves a Rajput masculinity and this very prickly kind of ideas of honor that these royal clans had into the story. And he also kind of connects it to lots of other interesting stuff, including Babur's emergence on the Indian historical scene, the desperation of like collecting armies and trying to fight off rebels, which again is kind of interesting when we think about rebellions and civil wars. The way they're presented to us is that it's almost inevitable that the royal line is going to win out at the end, but the reality of it is that things are always so much more precarious. Hiring those many soldiers, keeping them loyal to you, dealing with the egos and the prickly masculinities of all these men, keeping them happy and tied to your royal line, having them respect your heir, creating institutions, it's all a very very complex process. And it's great that there's historical fiction that at least touches upon all these aspects, and most importantly makes royals seem like complex human beings and not the caricatures they're made out to be generally, especially by Bollywood and Tollywood films.
Yeah, absolutely. And not just the royals. I mean, historical fiction. Some of the historical fiction I
Hmm.
read was it really illuminates the lives. It's a subaltern history in many ways of India, which is that perspective is almost completely missing
Hmm.
in most of Indian history that we read. So, one writer that I would hugely recommend, and he's criminally underrated. He's called Sujit Saraf, and he's written these couple of fantastic historical fiction books which delve into the anthropology
Hmm.
of certain communities, and how these communities have interacted with modernity, how the colonial and the colonial encounter has shaped them in so many ways. So one of these books is called Harilal and Sons, and it talks about the journey of this Marwadi family from the deserts of Shekhawati to Calcutta first, and then they move on to Bangladesh. And just
Hmm.
it's the history of this community, and he himself is a Marwadi, so he's done intensive research, interviews with his own family members, the elderly especially, who have lived through the time, and it brings out such fantastic sociological
Hmm.
details, right, about the Marwadi community. For example, in like one instance, these guys are based in Bangladesh at one point, and then there's rumors of that partition is going to happen very soon and so on, and the patriarch of the family says, let them make India and Pakistan. We will do business in both. and just so much insight into the community. So that's the first book. And the second book that I read was called The Confessions of Sultana Dak. And this is essentially about very, very the communities in north, mainly the Rohilkhand area of Uttar Pradesh. And these communities, they are nomadic communities, and their job at one point was the profession was thieving. So how the tradition of dacoity is connected with these communities. So often nomadic communities, when railways were built, when markets expanded, they lost their purpose, right? Their essential occupation was completely fell by the wayside due to modernity, and some of them took to thieving and so on. And these guys were interned in these massive facilities by Christian missionaries. It's a fascinating aspect of Indian history I had no idea about. And they were under the Criminal Tribes Act. They were made to register at all times with the police. The police picked them up at the slightest suspicion. So these kind of aspects are and even in Gangs of Wasepur, you hear the beginning. In the beginning, they talk about Sultana Daku, and this is the same Sultana Daku.
Oh.
He's a historical character, but Sudhir Saraf has constructed this entire story of the community around him. And it's just mind blowing. I loved it. There's another book called The Peacock Throne by him, which is about 1980s India, which I've heard is equally good. So
Damn.
I've
Okay,
been
this
meaning to
is.
read that for the longest time. But
Yeah, I'm just looking at his at the descriptions of his books, and they seem so absolutely compelling, dude. Like I'm absolutely going to read them.
they're amazing. I'm telling you, the fact that this guy hasn't won any major literary award that I know of, at least, it's a travesty. I don't know how the literary establishment in India has ignored him. I just love his writing, and he's criminally underrated. I think he should be read more.
See, here's the thing. So one thing that I find very interesting is the question of gaze generally when I'm reading historical fiction, right? The especially the gaze that the author has towards a particular kind of historical dynamic. And it's very rare to find authors who are able to, how do I put this, bring out the darker, grittier, and more, and to me at least, the more human side of historical events. And I think very often the popularity of an author depends on how well their gaze kind of gels with the gaze of the audience themselves. One great example, though I really hesitate to call his work historical fiction, is Amish Tripathi and his Immortals of Meluha series and his series on Suhail Dev, I think, this totally imaginary king that he seems to have made up, which give this idea of this ancient India was this perfect utopia, this Indus Valley civilization that was totally Vedic, where caste was decided by entrance exams when people were children, and like for anybody who is actually familiar with the history, it's very obvious this is pure crap, right? But they have considerable entertainment value, and the thing is that they also kind of coincide with the biases that media has kind of been building up in audiences over the last few generations or so, by kind of painting historians, archaeological work, hard historical facts as basically a conspiracy against national pride or so that kind of thing, you know. And as a result of that, like, I think this really is the darker side of quote unquote historical fiction, especially when mythology is presented as history and it plays into the preconceived notions and biases that we generally have. I feel like it can also be a tool for spreading narratives and perspectives of history that aren't exactly conducive to a deeper understanding, which is in stark contrast to the work that you're describing of, you know, Vishwas Patil. And so this actually brings me to another book that you, I know, quite enjoyed, Rajat, but I have rather more complicated feelings on, and that is Ponniyin Selvan, this epic by the Tamil writer Kalki, which explores the early career of Arul Morivarman, who would later be known to history as Rajaraja Cholan. So tell us a little bit about the book itself, what do you think about the way it presents the Chola Empire, and then perhaps you can talk a little bit more about these two big themes of, you know, historical awareness versus presenting an accurate understanding of history to audiences.
So I read Ponniyin Selvan last year during the lockdown, and I enjoyed it. I mean, I wasn't looking at it from the perspective of historical veracity or how it has. It was just a entertaining story with character. I mean, it's almost like a fantasy story. I wouldn't even. It's almost partly fantasy. It's not exactly historical fiction, I would say, though it has characters who are rooted in history. But his treatment of them, his treatment of the story too, it's that like of a fantasy book. I read it like I binge read Harry Potter as a kid, and after that I binge read this Punyan Selvan because I loved the flow of the story, and I didn't critique it as much while I was reading it. But you're right in the sense that it
Hmm.
glorifies the kings into these superhuman figures. It's not even like they're not even human anymore. They're capable of amazing feats. Their character is without any blemish, and so on. So
Hmm.
in that sense, you're absolutely right that it's a kind of a hagiographical portrayal of the Cholan.
So the main reason why I have an issue with this kind of portrayal of the Choras is partly because I run this meme page on Instagram called the Chola Bhatura Empire, where I poke fun at various medieval Indian polities and try to explain history through memes. And as you can imagine, I've gotten into a lot of trouble with Ponniyin Selvan fans who seem to think that the Choras were actually as they were presented in the work of Kalki. Now the thing is, I get the need for searching for pride in our past, right? That perhaps is one of the overriding dynamics, not just of Indian history in the 20th century, but also of Chinese history in the 20th century, especially if you look at the way that modern China presents its past. But here's the thing, right? When we are thinking about the Choras, we have to understand that they are human characters. They were as vulnerable to greed, to urges towards seizing power at all costs as any other human being. Now, this is something that comes across very clearly in the kind of historical fiction that we were talking about earlier in this podcast, right? Especially the examples that you gave. Now, I understand why Kalki would say this, but it's also more complex to me because somehow today, when we think about South Indian history and when we think about figures that are the heroes of regionalism, of regional nationalism in Karnataka or in Tamil Nadu, we always look at the medieval rulers. We look at the Cholas, we look at the Chalukyas. They are separated enough from us and they're connected enough to our idea of medieval India as this glorious Hindu utopia, which is really not borne out by the evidence, needless to say. Now, the interesting thing is that the as a result of like this emphasis on the great medieval royal heroes, we ignore much more interesting dynamics that emerged in the early modern period. So, for example, especially if you look at the Nayakas of Tamil Nadu in the early modern period, these guys are, I would say, really the capstone in the great arc of Tamil history before the coming of the British, because they bring with them this courtly Telugu culture that is inspired by the salons of Vijayanagara. They bring with them this ethos of this very earthy, materialistic kingship that is interested in the arts just for the sake of the arts, and they just want to show that they're rich and they are cultured. And as a result of that, there are these very interesting new social dynamics that come up, such as, for example, courtesans composing poetry and becoming renowned poetesses, really, which is so unique, especially compared to most of Indian history. But these dynamics are all ignored because they don't fit into this quote unquote Brahminical sort of interpretation of history that's all about great kings and pious religious teachers, right? Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, but at the same time, I feel that we should give Kalki some leeway because he was writing in the 50s when the historiography itself was completely nationalist, and K. Nilkanta Sastri was the dominant authority. All these perspectives had not
Yeah,
yet
he's
emerged.
still the dominant
Yeah,
authority.
I mean, there were all these different perspectives on history had not really developed at that point. It's only in the 60s and 70s when Marxist way of the economic determinism, all that started to play into historical understanding. So I feel we should. I mean, that's the spirit in which I read Ponniyin Selvan, and I quite
No,
enjoyed
no,
it.
fair enough. Fair enough, fair enough. I mean, I'm not decrying Ponniyin Selvan as a work of literature. My only issue with it is in terms of the kind of historical understandings it kind of gives
Yeah,
us. And the thing is, having read Ponniyin, like I read like the first book or so of Ponniyin Selvan before, I was like, I cannot do this anymore because I was getting too angry. The thing is that like there's a tendency that like, I mean, this again is a bit of a tangent, but I know Neil Kanta Shastri gets like a lot of flack, and like I have given him a lot of flack in my own like work because I find some of his interpretations and the evidence he chooses to base it on rather annoying. But he's actually relatively more nuanced in his approach to the choras. Like he's willing to like say that these guys aren't angels, and to kind of point out the messed up things that the choras did, even if he's situating them within the broader narrative of Tamils are great and South India is very great and kings are great. So I mean, it's a little more. I feel like Kalki could have done better, but that's just my
For sure,
personal
we
opinion.
could have done better. For
But I
sure.
think the real what really bugs me is that there isn't a lot of sophisticated popular fiction about medieval India yet. Where are the tomes that are exploring, for example, the Veerashaiva revolution from the bottom up? I think you actually mentioned that you had read a book on those lines, but I don't think that it's really reached mainstream audiences or become very popular yet, has it?
I mean, history in India, the main problem is history in India is still alive.
Hmm.
It is still alive and kicking. We cannot approach history with the detachment that, say, the Europeans do for their medieval period, where they're just kings and they're knights, and who gives a damn? Like, we're not connected to them in any way. But here, the identity of castes, of communities, they are linked to historical figures systematically, even more so as
Yeah.
the castes are beginning to assert themselves. So, for example, when I was traveling with the Gujjars on my truck trip,
Hmm.
I was surprised to note that the Gujjars still claim the Gurjara Pratihara king Mihir Bhoja as Gurjar Samrat.
Yeah.
So they claim that he is one of their own. So everyone is looking for a hero in India, and the slightest perceived insult to these heroes is taken as an affront that merits some kind of retaliation. So that's why historical fiction in India, like going into it itself, is a very, very contested affair. I mean, it's a minefield you have to navigate because history in India is like still completely alive. And so because of that, I think the historical fiction writers have faced these challenges, and it's not been able to emerge as a genre in its own right. Wide range of titles and so on.
Yeah, I mean, I have rather complex feelings about this because, on the one hand, I understand that connecting yourself to a particular ruler, a particular historical figure, and tying the identity and legends of your particular social group to that figure is a way of claiming status, right? We were just chit chatting before we started recording this episode, and we talked about the example of the Chera Perumals of Kerala. And what is so interesting to me about the Chera Perumals is that the Perumals are like every major religious tradition that exists in Kerala will claim some or the other connection to the Cheras. Muslims, for example, claim that the last Chera Perumal actually converted to Islam and then died in Mecca. The Vaishnavas claim that one of their Alvars was a Chera Perumal. The Shaivas claim that one of the Nayanars was a Chera Perumal. And apparently, there's also apparently when the Portuguese came to try and dominate Kerala, they started putting about the story that the last Chera Perumal had in fact converted to Christianity and not to Islam. So this it's very interesting how communities kind of advance these claims and to kind of tie them to history. And I understand historically why it was that important. I understand that as castes are rising and falling in the hierarchy, they start making these claims. So you see it across India and you see it across castes, across regions, across different points in time. But increasingly, like I'm starting to feel that if history becomes such a minefield that any statement of historical fact or any statement of historical nuance can be used to advance claims of, oh, you have insulted my such and such social group, therefore we will file a police case against you, we end up shooting ourselves in the own foot. Because the only way that we're going to learn more about the histories and the claims and the stories of all these different social groups is if they're brought into the public domain. And bringing them into public domain through academia is as itself a minefield, given the lack of academic freedoms that India is seeing today. But especially through historical fiction, that's a way to reach a lot of people, to communicate these beautiful stories, and beautiful nuanced human stories effectively and at scale, and to potentially help authors from a much wider array of social backgrounds rise to prominence. So at least my personal opinion is that it's time that we mature a little bit and allow these stories to be told.
Completely in agreement over there, and I hope that day comes soon. But it's quite because of these sort of factors that community, like you said about community mobilization and so on, it seems a bit difficult. But I really hope so. But in any case, many of these amazing books, like I was talking about Sujit Saraf,
Hmm.
hardly anyone reads them, so there's no outcry or anything. So I feel that historical fiction writers can go ahead and do whatever they want. there's not much to worry about.
Well, thank you so much for all these fascinating recommendations and points that you brought up, Rajat. Do you have any final thoughts, any final recommendations you would like to make to our listeners?
Yeah, definitely. So some of the historical fiction that I've enjoyed reading the most is that which combines historical fiction with detective fiction. So there is Sujata Masi's series on, the first book is called The Murder in Malabar Hill, I
Hmm.
think. So that one features a female protagonist, and she's the first female lawyer in India, and it's set in early to 1920s India. And it's amazing. It's a murder mystery investigated by this female lawyer. And second book in this particular genre is
Damn.
Abir Mukherjee's Sam Wyndham series, which is about this inspector in 1910s or so in India, and he has this sidekick called Surendra Nath Banerjee, who he called Surrender Not Banerjee, and he has an opium problem, and it's amazing. And the kind of historical details that he explores, it's very good. Apart from that one book, like, so many people travel to Goa, but very few people explore its history, right? So one historical fiction about Goa was The Age of Frenzy by Mahabaleshwar Sale, which is about the Portuguese arrival in Goa in the 1500s and what sort of effect it had on Goan society
Hmm.
in terms of convergence, in terms of in terms of the caste hierarchies. It's just amazing, and the level of detail and it's originally a Konkani book, so you can be assured of its authenticity. The writer is very much rooted in that soil. And of course, the big daddy of historical fiction for me is A Suitable Boy, which is just another level in terms of how it explores in early 1950s India. And apart from that, female writers have written some very good books. There's this book called The Fear of Lions by Amita Kanekar, which is about the Satnami rebellion in Aurangzeb's reign. It's a very less talked about rebellion uh, of mostly the lower castes who formed a collective identity called the Satnamis. They tonsured their heads and they posed a huge challenge to the might of Aurangzeb. That's another very interesting book. Then another female centric book is called Joroshanko by Aruna Chakravarti, and this one explores the history of Tagore's family and mainly its female members and how that influenced Tagore and so on. So it's very good. So I think these would be some of the recommendations. There are many more amazing historical fiction books, but these are some of the broad recommendations I would like to leave the listeners with.
Amazing. I know that I'm going to be busy with my Kindle reading for the next few months at least with all these recommendations. So, bloody hell, this is absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much, Jarat. Thank you for, it's always a pleasure having you on All Things Policy. Thank you so much for these thoughtful recommendations and themes that you brought up over the course of this discussion. And we hope to see you again very, very soon.
Thank you so much, Anirudh. It was an absolute pleasure being here.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. I'd like to thank the sponsor of the network this week, Credentia. Thank you so much for making this possible. On Cyrus Says, Cyrus was joined by actress Shreya Pilgaonkar to talk about her career in acting. On Begin the Journey, Ashish Vidyarthi lists down the modern concepts of friendship and how one can choose the right friend circle in life on Begin the Journey. On The Habit Coach, Ashton Doctor was joined by Aisha Bilamoria to talk about running and developing an athletic mentality. Farhad and Sunethra are joined by LGBTQ workplace advocate Suresh Ramdas to discuss the new normal in queer relationships on KBCD. On Tere Mere Raste, Keshav Chaturvedi takes us to the riverbanks of Banaras and describes the soulful mornings to us. And finally, on the Positively Unlimited podcast, Chetna Chakravarti takes the fear out of the word responsibility. And with that, I hope to see you again next week.
Want to learn something new and have a few minutes to spare? Well, then go for the Traveling Professor's Diary, where I, Siddharth Deshmukh, the Traveling Professor, will help you glean from all the insights that I've gained from wherever I've traveled, learned, taught, and repeated. Join me every Tuesday and Thursday on the IVM Podcast website, app, or wherever you get your podcasts from.